Good afternoon. My name is Louise Robbins. I'm co-chair with Kathy Christoph of the Electronic Technology Committee, and we put on programs with a fair degree of frequency. And today I'm very happy that we have one that is timed to go with the time of the year, and that everybody, or a lot of people at least, will be with friends and neighbors or family in the upcoming holiday season. And so this program on gathering family stories, capturing and keeping, is, I hope, readying you for that experience. Since June 2007, Troy Reeves, our speaker today, has led the oral history program at UW-Madison Archives. In that position, he has overseen the key components of managing an oral history program, collecting and curating oral history recordings, as well as communicating and collaborating with interested individuals about the art and science of oral history. Along with those program roles, he has managed over a dozen oral history projects focusing primarily on UW-Madison's rich history. He has also been published in historical journals, including the Western Historical Quarterly, the Public Historian, and the Oral History Review. He will do his spiel first. If you have questions, please hold them, and there'll be time to talk about them at the end. Thank you very much. Troy.
All right, can everybody hear me? Nice. Thank you, Louise. Special thank you to Louise. Louise was the first one who gave me the opportunity to teach a semester-long class through what was then called SLIS. Now it's called the iSchool. So thank you, Louise, for giving me the opportunity to come. This is a title. I don't remember what I told Louise my title was going to be, but this is the current title of this presentation: How to Capture and Keep Your Best Stories at Any Age. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'll entertain as many questions as you have, and then I will go back home and work from home. So it's been delightful to be over here to be able to work near my house today. Not that my office isn't delightful, but you'll see when I show this next slide a little bit about where I work. So I want to, we're loud. I want to talk a little bit about a little bit of context about who I am and why I'm here. I do this because the very first presentation I ever gave was in Idaho for graduate students of the University of Idaho. Their professor asked me to, I say come up because Boise is south of Moscow, so up to Moscow, Idaho. And I got to Moscow, I got to the history department, was inside their big historic administration building, beautiful building, beautiful oak table. I'm sitting at one end, the professor's sitting at the other, and then the students are around us. And unlike the introduction that Louise gave, the professor just said, okay, here's Troy Reeves. So I started speaking. This was in the era before PowerPoint, or at least before I used PowerPoint, so I had 3x5 cards. I was sweating so profusely immediately that the 3x5 cards started to ruffle. The ink on them started to fade. I was speaking at probably like 175 words a minute, 200 words a minute. I mean, I was cooking. And I get done with my first 3x5 card, and I sort of look up to gauge the audience, and there's a young man next to the professor. I say young man, he was probably like 3 years younger than me at the time, has his hand up. And I'm thinking, I've engaged someone within like a minute of my first presentation. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself, and I finish my thought. And I say, yes, you have a question. Puts his hand down, he says, yeah, who are you and what are you doing here? I found out afterwards from the professor that at the end of the previous class that he attended, she had talked a lot about who I was and what I was going to be doing there, so I could spend my time talking about oral history. So he wasn't a great listener. We'll talk a little bit about listening and the importance of listening as we go along. So I always try to spend a little bit of time talking about who I am and why I'm here. So there's 3 pictures there. The picture on that side, top, is Arco, Idaho. That is indeed all of Arco, Idaho. It fits nicely on a picture of that size. That is where my grandmothers lived really from about the 70s until the late 90s. mid to late 90s. They lived there in 1990 when I was given the opportunity to not take a history test if I found someone who lived through the Great Depression, interviewed them, and wrote a paper about it. So I drove to Arco, Idaho, which was about 90 miles from Idaho State University, where I did my undergrad. Go Bengals. And I interviewed them separately. One lived in the flat there, and then one lived just below that hill. That hill is called Numbers Hill because at the end of each year, the students of Butte County High School hike up that hill with a big bucket, or probably several buckets of white paint, and write the last 2 digits of their year, graduating year on that hill. They've been doing it for over a century now. My dad hiked up that hill in 1956 to help paint the 5-6. My mom had a pass because she had just given birth to my brother 6 weeks before her high school graduation. So my grandmothers had lived there for quite some time. So I interviewed them separately about the Great Depression. And once I left those interviews and I drove back to Pocatello, even at that age, I was 19, it dawned on me that this process of asking them questions, listening to the answers, I won't say I asked follow-up questions because I was 19 years old and I had this list, and come hell or high water, I was going to ask the questions on the list and I was going to be done. But the process of it had humanized my grandparents. And what I mean by that is before that, my grandmothers were nothing more than cookie receptacle devices. Truly, I mean, they made great cookies and I was a connoisseur. But I found out more about them, and more about them when they were of an age closer to mine. Like before that, I knew them as old women. I mean, they were in their 70s, 80s by the time I knew them, by the time I had any context of their life. So I knew from that point forward that if I was going to be a historian, which I wanted to be, I was going to incorporate oral history into my research. So not only looking at the written record and the visual record, but the oral or the oral record. So I did various oral history projects, and that eventually got me here to UW-Madison. So the picture in the middle, some of you might be familiar with that shot. That shot is of Russell Labs to the left, and Steenbach Library to the right. So you might be able to see that Steenbach Library, the shorter of the two buildings, have some windows on the top there. I have an office that has one of those windows. So unlike many archivists, I have a view, but I have a view of the side of Russell Labs. Not the best view, but I do get some natural light every now and then. The other picture I just have up because I want you to know that the oral history program is part of the University Archives or the UW-Madison Archives. Among the many things we have at the University Archives is between 2 and 2.5 million photos. We've never counted them. Like, you know, I tell students that if we give you the job to count photos, we really don't like you, because it would be a job that would take the rest of your student life. But we know we have at least over 2 million, and we only have about 20,000 scanned. So we have many more photos that aren't scanned than are. But this is one that we have scanned of the bed race in 1970. If you do see an image that you're interested in, the S number to the side would help me identify it if you ever say, I'm interested in, a copy of that picture. So just keep that in mind if you see a picture that interests you, because I try to put on these slides pictures of from our archival collection. So I'm now here. I've been here 11 years, and my job at the head of the oral history program is to talk about oral history, also collect oral history. Specifically, the examples I'll try to give today will focus on the difference or sort of the subtle difference if you're going to do oral history with family members. So what this talk isn't. I'm smart enough to know what I don't know. I am not a memoir writer. I don't train people to write memoir. So if you are here thinking that I'm going to give you the tools to then go home and write your memoir, I apologize in advance. It's not what this talk is about. There are people in this community who are very good at teaching and helping people who want to take down their story or their family story that way. Louise has my contact information. I know some of you in the audience actually have my contact information too. If that's something you're interested in, you can certainly reach out to me and I will point you to people such as Sarah White, who runs First Person Productions, And Sarah gives memoir writing classes and workshops around the city, or at least she did as of last year. I haven't kept in touch with Sarah as much as I should, but that really, she excels at that. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about an overview here of how I would go about conducting interviews with my family, which I haven't done, by the way, because my family's crazy. But, I mean, I love them to death, but I really don't want to have to sit and record them. But I understand that you all might, so I'm going to look at this in terms of how I would approach something like this. So, if I'm going to focus on family history interviews, I probably will start actually not with a chronological approach, meaning I'm not going to start with their early memories and then childhood, education, career, retirement. You can certainly do that. I would probably try to focus on a topic within either the family history of the person you're interviewing first. I would do that because, A, that way it's a way for you to do maybe a shorter interview or two and find out whether it's something you really want to do. You know, there's nothing like telling your relative that you're going to do 6 hours of oral history and, you know, like 6 minutes into it, you realize you've made the biggest mistake you've ever made in your life. Whereas if you just do a 60-minute interview on some aspect of their life that is, that you feel is of importance, you do that and then you get a taste of what it means to do an oral history interview. And then if you like it, then you certainly can do additional interviews with them or more interviews with your family members. Even though these are your family members, you're going to want to find out something about them. The term oral history, the second word is history. I mean, if you're going to try to be an oral historian, the second term is historian. And as a historian, you should try to do background research on the person or the topic. You certainly can find some sort of recording device, find a family member, turn it on and say, okay, tell me about your life. You can do that. There are interviews in the collection at UW-Madison and in Idaho, where I worked previously, where people have done that. Those interviews have honestly very little value because you can tell that the person doing the interview hasn't taken the time to really do this right. The phrase I use is that general questions beget general answers, and you can get general answers anywhere. I mean, if you're going to do oral history, whether it be with a family member or somebody on campus, the thing that's going to be important, I feel, to future generations and current generations is if you take the time to ask questions specific of them and get their specific memories. If you want to do family history, oral history interviews, find some help. Me. That is what I'm here for. I'm one of 2 full-time paid oral historians in the state. The other is the oral history archivist at the Wisconsin Vets Museum up at the top of the square. She focuses primarily on veterans, which leaves me everybody else. I'll be in Elkhart Lake actually on Saturday, helping the Wisconsin Historical Society at their annual meeting, giving a mini workshop on oral history, because, as you all know, we have something called the Wisconsin Idea. And we believe that in the libraries that we should do our best to be out in the community. And so that's what we do, and that's one of the reasons, again, why I'm here today, and why I would be willing and able, if you are serious about conducting oral history interviews and want additional help, to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to provide additional assistance. So find a recorder. Oral history demands a recording device. You may have noticed I didn't say I did oral history with my grandparents because I was 19 and I was dumb, and I did not record them. I had a pen and paper. I took notes. I wrote a paper, got an A, by the way, and that was that. Fortunately, my paternal grandmother did a short video before she passed away, so we have her face and voice as long as we remember to transfer it from VHS to a digital format. But my mother's mother, who out of the 2 was by far the better storyteller, we have no audio artifact, if you will, from. So oral history demands you to use some type of recording device. I may have a slide later where I'll talk a little bit more about that, and if not, I will talk a little bit more about that before I finish up. You need to ask them questions. I mean, that seems to possibly be a no-brainer. I mean, to do an oral history interview sort of requires a question to be asked to start the process. I will say that I have had people that have been so eager to tell their story that I've had to stop them long enough for me to at least say what we were doing. They have been so engaged that they wanted to just immediately start off with whatever their first and best story was. Might be the case with your family members, may not. And then I think if you're doing family history, you can always ask them to reciprocate. I mean, you are a family member, you have stories to tell, so maybe you can find someone that is willing to be interviewed, but then also to learn enough about it to then interview you as well, so you have another family history document. The terrace, we all know, most of us probably know the terrace. This is one of my favorite pictures. We don't know the exact time period, but we can certainly guess by those skirts there that the young women are wearing at that table. And again, an image from our collection. So we talk about recording devices. The best thing you can do is to try to conduct an interview with as little sound, ambient sound, background noise as possible. I hope that's apparent, but I've listened to enough interviews where I know it's not. So I want to play a couple of examples. One, I'm going to go out to the website to StoryCorps. Those of you who don't know StoryCorps, it's an effort that's ongoing, I think 15 years now, to try to gather stories from people around the country. Those stories are then deposited at the Library of Congress. It's probably the largest audio collection in the country now in terms of numbers. This is what StoryCorps' front page looks like, or at least the page that I link to. StoryCorps is also on national NPR, usually every Friday morning, I believe. They do a segment. But these are what they have on their website. I'm just going to click on this one. I don't know if I'll play it or not, but this is one that's certainly a family. And it's actually an example of a family member or a story sharing session that goes into a sensitive subject. So this was Emily. Did this go out? Is this okay? We're okay? Okay. So Emily and Linda, a father, a daughter, and a mother, and the mother tried to commit suicide a few years ago, so this is the first time they talked about it, and they chose a venue like StoryCorps to not only talk about it, but in the hopes that people will be able to learn from her experience. Again, I probably won't play the clip. Mainly I won't play it because I didn't vet it, I'll be honest with you. But I want you to see if I can get there. Yeah, I can't get there. No. Right, I bet it made absolutely no sense at all as I'm talking about this and you're looking at a blue screen. All right. Is the little arrow moving? Oh, at least the little arrow's moving. All right, so I can see that. I'm going to click here. All right. This is what I love about technology. Let's see if I can get us there. Okay. So this is the part of the show where I ad-lib a little bit while we get the computer going again. So I was talking about good sound, and when I get the computer back up, we'll play a clip from an interview I did with Bill Cronin. I think most of you probably know who Bill Cronin is. If you don't, very prominent professor on campus, both history and environmental studies. I had an inkling that his mother lived here. I know that he talked about her a little bit during the oral history, but I think at that point she was still, I think she still might have been in her house. All right, so I'm just going to do this for a second. Okay. Sorry, if I could give you those minutes of your life back, I would. All right, so let's play this clip from Bill Cronin, and really it's an example of an interview that was done, and then this isn't just because I did it. It's an interview that was done where the person thinking about it thought about how to keep the sound as quiet as possible.
I was asked to give the honors convocation address. I've already mentioned this in May of my senior year, delivered in the shell over by Camp Randall to an audience of maybe 1,000 graduating seniors and their families. Mm-hmm. And because this is the energy crisis, right, and one of my political concerns is energy, I gave a speech.
All right, so that's a little too quiet, and I'm afraid if I go back out to try to turn the volume up on my computer that we will be doing the whole dance we just did. What little you could probably hear, those of you who could hear it, was you could hear his voice and not a lot else. This clip is a little louder. So we had an example of good sound. My hope is that when we play this one, we'll have an example of, well, not so good sound. And you'll see the difference between the two. And I just have trouble finding my pointer for some reason. It was working, it's just really quiet. It's quieter than it was when we tested it, so I'm not quite sure why that is. And then, of course, oh, there it is. Hello.
Very tenuous positions, and they tend to fall down, and you watch out for that kind of thing. You certainly watch out for falling rock all the time. And be careful to yell whenever you knock the rock loose so then anybody below.
So that's an example of an interview that was done inside a washing machine. Okay, it really wasn't done inside a washing machine. But it is an example of just kind of keeping in mind the idea that background noise can affect you anytime, anywhere. That's an interview I did in Idaho where I realized that even the slightest thing like water, that was actually water misting down from a trellis, a patio trellis. I conducted that interview outside, and there was also a little bit of wind because we were conducting the interview outside. I don't normally conduct interviews outside, but that interview was happening in a house that was being remodeled, so there was absolutely zero room to conduct the oral history interview inside. This is where when there are students in the audience or students that I work with, they'll come back to me and they'll say, the interview I think went pretty well, but there was one time when a plane flew overhead and I'm afraid that that will mess up the sound. I'm like, okay, don't worry about a plane flying overhead unless it's actually, you're on the runway, you'll be all right. So it's an idea of just trying to keep the sound as minimal as possible while understanding that there will indeed probably be some background noise. Another key to minimize that is to actually use good recording tools that allow you to get the microphone, this thing dangling by my lips, as close to the person as possible too. And that's the person speaking. This is where I give examples again from students, bless their hearts, that I will listen to the interview and the questions are very well, the volume on the questions are very well done. Like today is whatever, I'm here with my grandfather, I'm going to ask him about his life. And they will ask a question and then grandfather's voice is very soft because they haven't quite realized that the microphone actually probably needs to be closer to the person that's answering the questions and not the person asking them. I know you all wouldn't do that, but I just want you to make sure you know that the microphone needs to be closer to the person answering the questions. This is where I remind people of a saying that my now 16 but then 14-year-old daughter would say to me. She would have friends over, and in the interest of trying to be the cool dad, I would try to ingratiate myself to her friends by asking them, about music and TV, and my daughter would get close enough to me to usually just say it just to me, Dad, no one is here to see you. As the interviewer, you are not the star of the show. No one needs to know how smart you are. You are there to ask questions, hopefully good ones, and then listen to the answers and ask better follow-up questions. So keep the microphone close to the star of the show. All right. So this is where I give some tips, some general ideas about, again, if I was to approach this, some things I would think about. Some of this is reiteration of what I just said earlier, but I think it's important sometimes to hear some things more than once. So these next 2 slides are going to be me bombarding you with things to think about as you conduct oral history interviews, again, whether it be with your family or on a topic of your choosing. As I said before, do research. And that is just as incumbent as if it's, or just as important as if it's a family history interview than if it's an interview on a topic that you may not know much about. Create a topics or a question list. Students that I talk to love to have things written out, question word for word, and that's fine. But there are people who just have a script with basic ideas. So again, if you want to do chronology, the script might be childhood and then what you know about the person's childhood, school years and what you know about the person's school years, college, early career, et cetera, et cetera. Either way is fine. There's no hard and fast rule, and really it depends on how it's going to work best for you as the person asking the questions. If you need them written out word for word, then write them out word for word. If you don't, then don't. Even in family history, I try to meet with the person in advance. In oral history, we call this a pre-interview. Pretty straightforward. This is where we talk to them about what it means to do an oral history. If we're going to donate this oral history interview somewhere, we tell them that. We want to inform them as much as possible about what's going to happen to their interview. It allows them to ask questions of us because, again, when the recorder's turned on, we are not the star of the show. They are the star of the show. Also can help build rapport, which is just as important, I think, in a family history interview as in interviews that we do. This is where, if it was a family history interview, I would also tell them that I'm going to approach this as a historian and not as a family member, meaning there may be times I ask you to tell a story that you have told me 734 times, not that I'm counting, but I need you to tell it like you're telling it to a historian or a future generation and not like you're telling it to me. This is also where I would tell them to try to minimize the code that we use. Whenever we're speaking to people that we know well, we start to speak in code. Our stories start to become a bit truncated. Say 2 words like, you remember that time when Uncle Bill did this? And that's all we need to say, and we laugh and we have a good time, but no one else in the world knows that story. And if you're really going to do this, then you need to have somebody actually tell their version of the story. So explain the project to build a rapport. Again, we do this, if I was doing a family history interview, if I was going to interview my mother or any of my aunts or uncles, I would have this conversation with them before I turned on the recorder. Because again, I want them to know that I'm approaching this as a historian first and a family member second. Find a location. It may be at the Thanksgiving table, if you're going to be at somebody's house during Thanksgiving, which is fine-ish, just because sometimes the Thanksgiving table is probably going to have, so you'll have other people stop by, other people interject, and it's okay if that's your intent to try to gather as many stories as possible, but if you're going to do an oral history interview, the really best oral history interviews are one-on-one interviews. There are times when having more than one person will help sort of spark each other's memories, but there are times when having more than one person in the room will also minimize one person talking because the other person is the dominant personality, so they will talk, and the other person will say, oh yeah, I agree with that, because they don't want to cause any friction where they may not agree with that at all. So just keep that in mind. If I were doing this, as much as I would be comfortable at the Thanksgiving table, I would try to find a room somewhere else where, again, I could not only minimize the noise, but also minimize the people who are willing and able to interject into the conversation. So as I said before, the most important part of doing an oral history interview, well, there's 2 parts. It's really like 1A and 1B. You have to ask the questions. So you should have a list of questions or topics that you can build questions around, because it's not going to be much of an interview without questions. But just as important is listening to the answers and actively listening. So this is where I talk about my mother. My mother lives in Idaho, so I call her, I try to call her at least once a week, maybe a couple times a week. And after we talk about the weather, because it's very important to understand the difference between the weather in Idaho and Wisconsin, I figured that out. What happens is my mother will talk about a relative who I may or may not know, and a medical malady that's befallen that relative. So, Aunt Karen, rheumatoid arthritis. And as the number one son, which I tell my brother every time I talk to him, I listen. And I listen with my head, and I listen with my heart, and I listen with my ears. Actively listening requires probably at least 2 of the 3 of those things, if not all 3 of those things. And we end the phone conversation. So later in the week, my mother will call, and after we talk about the weather, because it's very important to talk about the difference in the weather between Idaho and Wisconsin, she'll talk about Aunt Karen and her rheumatoid arthritis. So now I've shifted subtly from listening to just hearing, because I've heard the story, and I'm polite enough to let her finish, and then we move on to something else. My mother will call again in a few days, or I'll call her. And after we talk about the weather, because it's important to understand the difference between the weather, she'll talk about Aunt Karen and the rheumatoid arthritis. And at that point, she sounds exactly like all the adults in all the Peanut cartoons that they show on TV. You'll get to see the first one in a week, I think, when they do the Great Pumpkin, and then they'll do Thanksgiving, and then they'll do Christmas. For those of you who don't know, all the adults in those cartoons are played by either the muted slide trombone or the muted trumpet. So the adults sound like this. Wah, 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 wah. I gave this presentation once in Gooding, Idaho with my mother in the audience. I glossed over this whole section because I'm the number one son. But seriously, listening is an art. And particularly, oh, now it's completely lost. Okay, no cracklies. All right. So we're going to listen. We're going to listen well to what's being said, because the hope is we're going to actually ask some follow-up questions. We're going to ask questions that aren't on our script, because we're listening well and we hear something that may not jibe with our version of family history, and so we might tactfully ask, as neutrally as possible, to have them elaborate on that. Or it could be untactfully, since it's family member. It's like, well, that's not how I heard the story. You may want to try a bit more subtly than that, but the point is, the hope is that you turn anecdotes into richer anecdotes by asking follow-up questions. My favorite follow-up question under any line of questioning is, do you have anything more to say about that? Hopefully it shows them you're interested, shows them that you care about what they have to say, and then you can move on to whatever the next topic or subtopic is. There should say balance the narrator's, your needs and the narrator's stories instead of the gender binary, but the point still is that this may be the one time that they're actually getting interviewed, so they may have an agenda. And that agenda might be different than yours. Like, you may want to ask about family history. They may want to talk about the time they played minor league baseball. So the Oral History Association, the national organization that oversees oral history, recommends that you try to figure out how to balance that. Particularly, again, if this is the one time that this person will be able to tell their story. I usually let them say what they want to say. As soon as there's a pause, I thank them for talking about their minor league baseball career. Tell them truthfully that if I get a chance, I'd love to ask more questions about it, because I actually do like hearing about baseball. But really, today, we're really interested in, whatever it is. Your thoughts about family history, or your time on campus, or whatever. This is also when I tell the students that you should be really, really clear that they are not just answering your question in a way that you didn't think about. This is where I interject, I think it's Jeffy from the Family Circus, the Sunday morning cartoon. Whenever mom or dad asks him to do something, that's usually a direct route, like to the store. You then see how he goes to this house, and then he goes out to this house, and then he hops over a fence and he goes to this house. So sometimes they get there, they just may not get there the way you want them to. Also, listening helps when they do lose their train of thought, because chances are they will lose their train of thought. So listening when they say to you, "Now where were we?" allows you to actually tell them where you were, as opposed to not listening and then you say, "Where were we?" and you go, I don't know. Where do you think we were? It's a rhetorical question that sometimes works when you're a teacher, but it doesn't work really well when you're an oral historian. So enjoy the silence and don't rush. What I mean by that is sometimes people will pause because they may have lost their train of thought, or they may be trying to figure out how to say what they want to say. They may be self-censoring. My good friend Jim Leary, retired folklorist on campus, he's always on campus anyway, but he's officially retired, at least from teaching, will say that you're not going to get everything. So don't go into a family history interview thinking you're going to get all the juicy family secrets, because we all self-censor. But you can at least let that silence fester a little bit to allow them to figure out how they want to finish their story. The silence may be implied, like you may be asking them about events that you know happened at least in this series of ways, and they may not be talking about one aspect of that. And so by knowing, you may be able to hopefully tactfully ask them why they're not addressing this part of the family history. This is where I always say future historians, or in this case, future family members, would chide me if I didn't ask you about this. And then in my mind, I picture them going, "Oh, those future family members, I wasn't going to answer this question, but now I have to because of the future. Oh." And then they're upset at the future, and they're not upset at you. Stay and chat, pretty easy to do in family history interviews, but the interviews that I do, I find that when you stay and chat, you learn more. Consider a follow-up interview even with family history. Some of the best interviews I do are follow-up interviews because usually I still have questions left on my list that I haven't asked. And if I've done a good job engaging them, chances are they will reflect upon it and say, "Oh, I wish Troy was here because I'd really like to talk about this," or "I forgot to mention this." And so then a follow-up interview allows them to have their time to talk more about things they want to talk about, and also allows you time to ask the questions that you maybe didn't get to ask. And since I work at an archives and oral history program, I'm contractually obligated to remind you too that a good oral history can not only benefit your family, but could benefit future generations. So if there's any part of the oral history interview that you think future generations besides your family may want to listen to, you can certainly contact me first, and we can talk about where that interview might be appropriately donated to. I know the Wisconsin Historical Society accepts oral history interview donations. I know we accept oral history interview donations. We have a little stronger standards in the Historical Society, and by that I mean we're really focused on campus history, whereas the State Historical Society has more a statewide basis. But if you do these interviews, my hope is you'll think about, well, who else might be interested in this other than the family? And that's not to say that putting it in the family archives isn't a completely appropriate place, because it is, if you have a family archive. My hope would be if you do, that you start to think about, well, how are these audio files going to be kept so the next generation of people will be able to listen to them? The power of oral history for me is actually getting to hear the people tell their story. I understand that that does limit people who have difficulty hearing or who can't hear. And for those people, we do try the best we can to create some sort of transcript so they can be able to read it. But if you have a choice, if you are able to either read a transcript or listen to the audio, my hope is that you will listen to the audio. I usually try to end with a funny one, but in this case, since this is campus, I'm going to, or at least folks who probably spent time on campus, I'm going to end with a clip from an interview that we did with David Schuster. David Schuster was a survivor of the Sterling Hall bombing in August of 1970. The last person, well, actually the only person the only living person that had to be pulled out of the building. He's going to talk about his car. So his car is the station wagon. And again, it's louder, so I hope between turning the volume up and playing it, you'll be able to hear it. It's about a 2-minute clip, I think.
Now the picture, I've kept this picture of those cars out there because that's my old Chevy station wagon with all the glass blown out. It was parked in the parking lot, the same parking lot as the truck bomb, partly shielded from it. So I didn't do too well inside, and it didn't do too well outside. And curiously, it's just stayed there for at least 3 weeks, I think, probably for 3 weeks. And eventually they asked me to get it out of there because I was okay by that time. So I thought, So I went and tried starting it, and it started. I can believe it. It started up. All the glass had been blown out and the bodywork was damaged, but the engine seemed to be okay. So I drove it home. I think I had to pump up the tires or something. So I drove it home, called a junkyard, and I'm not sure.
All right, well, that's the problem of having audio clips when you don't double check that the sound. Well, he's from South Africa, so you missed his lilting accent. But you also missed the fact that what happened was he was asked by campus to get his station wagon out of the parking lot. So he put the keys in, turned over, and it started, amazingly. I mean, you can see, let me go back. I mean, you can see that there is pretty much no glass left in that station wagon. You can see the body damage. It starts, he takes it to a wrecking yard and drops it off. And, since he was one of the survivors, there was a bit of news about him. And so he got a call from some town about a half hour away saying, we heard that the bomb not only damaged you, but the car. We just bought a new car, so can we give you our old one? So the last year he spent on campus, he was driving a Chevy Rambler that was donated by a family from 30 miles away. He does that story far more justice than I do, which is part of the whole idea of being able to hear the person tell their story. So the last thing I want to say is just a reminder. I think I've said this a couple of times, but I hope I will be considered a resource for you if you do decide to do either family history interviews or if you're interested in doing oral history on a campus topic. If you are interested in doing oral history on a campus topic, please let me know. I can let you know if we might already have interviews on that topic, or we might be able to point you to people who we haven't interviewed but we would like to. As the campus oral historian, almost without exception, I have somebody come up to me and say, I hear you're the oral historian. You should interview so-and-so. That has now given me a list of over 350 people. I am a one-person shop. I say we a lot, and this is where I get my dad's voice in the back of my head. Whenever I would say we growing up, and Dad knew that just meant me, he would say, what do you got, boy, a mouse in your pocket? So we is me. So we can only do what we can do with volunteers and classes, but we're probably not going to knock that list of 350 down. But I'm going to make a bet that somebody's going to come up and tell me to interview somebody anyway. So I'm happy to entertain questions. I guess we have two mics. We have the mic right there. So I will stand here, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I'm going to be interviewing my 103-year-old father, who grew up in Dietrich, Idaho, not far from Arco. Would it be more appropriate, if the recording turns out well, to donate it to an Idaho institution rather than UW?
Yes, it would. The Idaho State Historical Society accepts donations. Twin Falls, probably, their public library. I'm trying to picture Dietrich. Yeah, so Twin Falls might also be a repository. Actually, Jerome has a pretty decent, robust historical society too. Joan, if you want to reach out to me, I mean, you are, but if you want to follow up with an email, I can point you to some people. I'll point you to the State Historical Society first, because even though they don't have an oral history program anymore, they do accept oral history interviews. But yeah, that's by far the most appropriate place would be somebody in that community, And thank you for doing that as an Idahoan. Thank you for helping to contribute to our state's history.
Why is it that they only have one person doing this? Because it seems like really important work to me.
Do you want my politic answer? All right. So we as a university archives are a staff of 5. So I think within the Big Ten, we are small in terms of a university archives. As far as an oral history program goes, the libraries have been very supportive of making sure there is a person. There just hasn't been a lot of, honestly, wherewithal to give us more than one person. We did have a part-time interviewer at one point, and I think Joan may have been interviewed. Were you interviewed by Bob Lang? Yeah, so Bob Lang was our part-time interviewer, and then during one of the many recent budget crises, the libraries, as a cost-cutting measure, decided not to rehire anybody who was in any project position, so not just the project position at the oral history program, but anybody. And then there hasn't been, again, sort of the wherewithal to bring people back, which is why I'm quite reliant on volunteers and on classes that find out about me and are willing to conduct interviews on campus history. Ann?
Troy, I would offer a suggestion in response to what Diane was saying. When my oral history was done, I was convinced that it was as good as it was because the person that was interviewing me knew something about the role for which he was interviewing me. We were committee mates together. And it was ever so much better than if I had interviewed a total stranger. I don't know how she was put together with me, except we were on a committee together.
Right.
But it was great.
Yeah. So sometimes projects like the one you were interviewed for, like the academic staff was very interested when I first got here about conducting oral history, particularly with people who were around when the shared governance, that was the 80s, I think, right? When it finally was codified. So there were sort of the newer generation of academic staff that were interested in interviewing the older generation, if you will, no offense. And so they not only knew a little bit about the history, but they were also interested in getting enough training to be able to be a good interviewer. And so that's why I think those academic staff interviews that were done were some of our best stuff, because again, a well-prepared, well-trained interviewer was doing the interviewing. And that's the issue, if you will. I mean, you're all students of life, I get it. But there's no like undergraduate students in this audience right now, and they can be very well trained and very well prepared. They just don't have as much lived experience, and it's harder for them to particularly some of the intricacies of campus, to be familiar with or familiar enough with. So anyway, that's a great sort of follow-up plug to the fact that while we need people to conduct interviews, we need people who are willing to be trained and willing to learn a little bit about the topic.
I have
Yes.
a couple questions. One is, I'm not sure if I can do this with my cell phone. I have an Apple cell phone. Could I interview Ed, or could he interview me on, and could you also put pictures on? And the other question is, who is able to access these histories?
So the short answer to your question is yes. You can conduct an interview with an iPhone. You can conduct an interview with an Android phone too, which is the other model. You really need to think about what sort of application or app that you want to put on your phone to do that. And then what I tell the students is we need to think about in advance how we're going to get it off the phone, which also means you probably need an app to then allow you to take the phone from the inboard memory to some cloud-based service, whether it be Box or Google Drive or something like that. Because we have had students conduct interviews that have stayed on their phone. So what we had to do was we had to press play on whatever app and then record onto another device as it was playing, which isn't the easiest way. As far as photos, yeah, please. I mean, take photos with your smartphone, take photos with your camera. We can upload them to the same cloud-based folder and eventually have those living with the interview that we have online. The last question was, how do you access this? So you can certainly come to the University Archives during our hours, which are 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, and not any of the obvious holidays, like don't come on Christmas Eve, or Christmas for that matter. But we also have about, I think we're up to 1,000 now interviews online, so we have almost 1,800 interviews. We have 1,000 of them online. They're not the easiest interviews to find online, though. Usually what happens is if you're interested in a specific person, if you think a person's been interviewed, email me and say, has this person been interviewed? I'll check and see that. If they have, I will give you access, or I will show you where those interviews live online.
And are you located in Helen Hoyt?
No, we're located on the 4th floor of Steenbach Library. Yeah, so the archives has been in Steenbach Library for, the offices have been there for 11 years, but the archives themselves, I think, has been there almost since Steenbach was built. The archives themselves are in the basement, sub-basement of Steenbach. The offices are on the 4th floor, or top floor of Steenbach. I always tell people it's close to where the ice cream is made, because it is. And I also tell people that now when my kids come to see me, they just come to get money and go get ice cream, which is true, too. Any other
Between
questions?
ice cream and gardens, right?
Oh, yeah, the Allen Centennial Gardens is delightful, too. Yes. Do I loan equipment out? The answer to that is yes. We have at least a half dozen very good but small digital audio recorders that we loan out to either students or our volunteers or people who have attended one of these sessions and want to conduct an interview.
What format do you suggest you put things in so that it will last for more than 20 minutes?
I knew your face looked familiar. I was trying to figure out where I'd seen you. We recommend, and this is something that if you do get some type of digital recorder, I can probably talk through with you, or if you bring it to the archives, I can help you with. But there's files that we call them WAV files, because the file extension, so like a Word document, the file extension is DOC or DOCX. For audio files, the most robust, the less compressed files have a .wav at the end of it. So that's what we recommend you record in. Then what happens is we make a MP3 version of that, a compressed version of that, and that's what we give to people, or that we put online for people to listen to, because that's much smaller and much easier for people to be able to use. Thank you for both of those questions. You were a plant. I'd forgotten, so thank you. I always love having a plant in the audience. Yes?
I have the impression that sometimes you get a more complete telling of a story if you can offer to keep the recording confidential for some period of time. What do you recommend doing about that sort of thing?
Also a good question. So what we do, because we're an oral history program and we have an archives that we know will be, well, as much as one can know, we know that it will be around, is that we offer people the opportunity to embargo or restrict their interviews from anywhere from 1 to 50 years. We do have one interview that's been restricted longer than that. It's by our current mayor, who did interviews in the 1970s, and they are still restricted. They're going to be restricted till 2044, which I'm guessing will be the end of his 7th mayoral return. Sorry. I was going to try to not do politics, but so it's a great question, and let me sort of add to it, though, because there's been a change recently in our program, and that's, we're a public university. So what we are telling people from this point forward is that we intend for your interview to be online, and we explain what that means to people who don't know. So we give people the opportunity to embargo their interview from being online for a certain number of years, or just embargo it in general for a certain number of years. But we want people to know from this point forward, if they do an interview for us, it will eventually appear online. because that's the way of the world. And again, we're a public institution. We feel like the people that we interview, their interviews should be available. And more often than not now, we have people tell us that if they don't want it embargoed for a certain amount of time, they say, the reason why I'm doing this is I want it online. I want people to be able to hear, my thoughts about campus from wherever. So thank you for that question.
When you're saying that they're online, is that you currently could put them on? I didn't hear the 1 to 15 years or...
Oh, sure.
What?
So the interviews that we have online are readily available to people if they can find them. What happens...
Are they alphabetized by people's names or
No.
years they
No.
graduated?
No.
What
No.
sort of...
No, anything you say, I will answer no, because sadly, the way that our digital collections is set up, it's just not set up that way. So really, you can try to find it with a Google search with the person's last name, or better yet, you can contact me. We do have a PDF on our website that lists who's been interviewed, but I haven't updated that PDF in a couple years. So sadly, while our stuff is online, it's still not, or sadly or unsadly, I guess depending on how you want to look at it, it's not easy to find. The 1 to 50 years thing is referring to the fact that some people that we interview want to tell their story, but they want a little bit of cooling off time before the public gets to hear it. So then they can when they fill out the form, they can say, I'm fine with this being released, but not until January 1st, whatever, 2020, 2025, 2050. And then what happens is whoever the me is, January 1st, 2050, then gets to release that interview to the public.
And the last question, do you have any suggestions of things like our careers or college time or, for questions for the interviewer?
So I do have some...
A handout, basically.
Right, I do have some handouts.
Something online.
But I also refer people to a question I got in Idaho at least a few times where somebody would say to me, they would call and say, I'm getting ready to interview a miner, meaning somebody who mines, not like a younger than 18. What question list do you have for miners? Like, well, what did they mine? When did they mine? Where did they mine? Because all that's going to make a difference about what questions you ask them. So yes, I have some sort of like family history boilerplate about, again, childhood, growing up, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of that. But really, to do a good interview, you need to know enough about the person or the family to be able to ask specific questions that might be completely different than the questions you ask your uncle might be completely different than the questions you ask your grandfather. So if you want to reach out to me, and you can reach out through Louise or the Retirement Association, I can send you sort of a family history, very rudimentary, not rudimentary, but sort of overview of the type of questions. I can certainly send you that. But again, as I said before, general questions beget general answers, and you can get general answers anywhere. Yes, Ann.
In response to your question, one of my proudest family accomplishments is that I interviewed my mother, and I used a book that she had received from my other sister called The Grandmother's Book. She didn't want to fill it out in writing, but I used that as the basis for an interview done with a very old-fashioned reel-to-reel tape, not reel-to-reel, but cassette tape recorder. So I've got her voice, and then I transcribed the interview. And sent copies to my sibs. So you might find something like that. I think it's just something called the Grandparents' Book.
Could you say something about what equipment you recommend if we don't get it from you?
Sure. So I recommend a recorder, a very inexpensive entry-level recorder called a Zoom, and then the initials behind it are H, and then the number 2, and then the letter N. Full Compass sells it, so it's a Zoom, as in Z-O-O-M, and then the letter H, the number 2, and then the letter N. Full Compass sells you that, and then because Zoom wants to make as much money as possible, you have to then, well, you don't have to, but usually buy an accessory kit too, which has the plug-in, the USB cord that allows you to plug into the computer. It has a tripod to help the recorder get off the table a little bit. The Zoom I like because about half of it is an external microphone. And that way I don't have to figure out how to use, not that I don't know how, but lapel mics or things like that. The only downside is it is entry level and a little inexpensive. You just want to make sure you're as close to the person as possible, but really doing an interview, you should be as close to the person as possible. Which shouldn't be hard with family history, because you want to get comfy cozy with your family and listen to their stories, right? Everybody wants to be as close to their family members as possible.
One little piece of advice I have is don't wait. As I was sitting here listening to Troy, I was thinking, darn it, I should have talked to my sisters, Donna and Joyce, more than I did. I mean, I talked to them all the time. We lived together, of course, as we were growing up. But their lives went on after I left home, and there are big chunks I don't know, and there's no hope of retrieving that now.
Right. Yeah, we almost all of us who come to oral history come to it with a story about boss. For me, it would be either of my grandfathers. One passed away when I was 5, but the other lived into the early 90s. His health wasn't great in 1990, or I would have interviewed him too about the Great Depression. So yeah, I would say don't wait. Sure.
Other questions? Going once? Going twice?
I love this crowd because there was some great questions. Usually the students don't ask me any questions, so thank you for keeping me on my toes. And if this is all, thank you so much. Thank you again, Louise.
Thank you. You have a little something to keep you cozy.
Oh, that's nice.
On when you need a break.
That's great. I will take that to work, and I'll use it tomorrow when I take my nap. Okay, I don't take a nap at work.
Well,
I keep forgetting this is videoed.
Naps at work are supposed to be good for you, right?
It's true.
Well, thank you very
much.
much.
All right, thank you all.